Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank you, dear venerables, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us in one of our 20th anniversary events. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for tonight, Professor Amelia Hall. I'll give a little bit of background in case you wondering why is this here with us today. So Professor Hall obtained her doctorate in Tibetan and Himalayan studies from Oxford University. And ever since, he has taught and developed courses on Buddhism at Central Michigan University and Antioch University. She is currently an associate professor of Buddhism, and department chair in the Wisdom Traditions Department at Naropa University. She teaches across several different degree programs at Naropa, including a BA in Religious Studies, MA in Yoga Studies, MA in Contemplative Religions, and a Master of Divinity program. Her current research and translation work considers ritual texts in the Lugom collections, tries to explore the impact of traditional ecological knowledge on perceptions of climate change and landscape transformation in the Himalayas. Professor Hall's recent publications include Embodying the Diamond Soul, Tantric Pilgrims in a Secret Lotus Land, published in Body Trouble, Religious Boundaries for Sex, Gender, and Corporeality, which I had the great pleasure to be an editor and work with her on this project, and several other publications on Tertons, Tibetan Buddhist Treasure Revealers for Briel's Encyclopedia of Buddhism, How is the Sacred Place Arrayed, Pacification, Increased Magnetism, and Wrath in the Establishment of an Eastern Himalayan Bayul, also published in a great collection of works, Hidden Lands in Himalayan Myth and History. So she's currently working on her book on the Four Noble Truths to be published by Shambhala Publications. And with that very diverse background, and you might wonder, she's also quite a specialist on a topic that's very close to the mission of the Center of Buddhist Studies and to the Masters of Buddhist Counseling program. And that's basically, she will give us her experience working with Buddhist chaplaincy at Naropa University. So please, let's give her a warm welcome.
How's that? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Dr. Alkias, for inviting me, and thank you to Hong Kong University Center of Buddhist Studies and Tung Liu Kok Yuen, sorry if I said it incorrectly, as the sponsor. So this is my first visit to Hong Kong, and I've so far really enjoyed myself, and I feel so welcome. So thank you so much for your kind invitation. And I wanted to just add a little bit to what Dr. Halkias was saying, because one of the reasons that I'm here to talk about this topic is that I teach in what's called our Master of Divinity program at Naropa University. And we train chaplains, and it is the theological base of that program is Buddhism. And so I teach mostly what you would call the theological courses in that program. But I'm here to also just talk about some of the details, issues, challenges, things that hopefully will be of interest if you have curiosity about what Buddhist chaplaincy is in the United States. So at Naropa University, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Naropa, but we actually have a tradition that I think you will understand, is that we actually begin every lecture in our classrooms, we begin with a bow. So I'm going to begin with a bow to you. And hopefully I know all the buttons to work. Okay. Glasses. So Buddhist chaplaincy or spiritual care may appear to be a new and emergent field, but it begins actually with the very foundation of the tradition. 3 of the 4 signs that spurred Siddhartha to embark upon his path were old age, sickness, and death. the alleviation of which inspired him to determine a way to understand suffering, its causes, and its cessation. So Buddhist chaplains, whose primary vocation is to ease the suffering of others, are following in the footsteps of the Buddha, walking the path that he forged and providing skillful guidance to sentient beings. According to Buddhist tradition, Siddhartha Gautama wandered through northern India in the latter part of the 6th century, before the Common Era, and people became curious about him as he seemed to glow. He had a kind of radiance. So if you read the early descriptions of the Buddha after his awakening, he glows. So in a modern sense, you might also understand that as the Buddha radiated sanity. In accounts from the early suttas, he's asked if he was still human or some celestial being or God. And to these questions he replied, "I am none of these, I am awake." So in Buddhism, as I think we're all aware, there is no intercession from a creator or deity, but rather an emphasis on one's own ethical transformation. Practitioners apply their natural intelligence and basic goodness to be skillful and at ease amid challenging circumstances. They cultivate patience with their own and others' experiences. So the qualities a Buddhist chaplain aims to cultivate are those of the Buddha as he wandered the towns and villages of ancient India, radiating sanity, compassion, patience, resilience, generosity, and wisdom. Throughout history, human communities commonly identified spiritual leaders with the designated role of attending to community members suffering from physical, emotional, and spiritual disorders. Many indigenous communities practice forms of spiritual care rooted in ancient wisdom and practices passed down through oral traditions and mentoring. So I want to give you, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time giving you a kind of history lesson, but I wanted to give you a sense of the field of chaplaincy in the United States. So while it has deep roots in the Christian clerical tradition, chaplaincy as a field has grown. It's growing more and more towards embodying an interreligious approach as a field in healthcare institutions, facilities, hospice, prisons, the military, all sorts of different outpatient settings. In healthcare, chaplains are integral members of clinical interdisciplinary teams across medical specialities. But chaplaincy in the United States exists at this real intersection of diverse worlds of meaning. Hospitals, for example, in the United States are among one of the most culturally and religiously diverse public institutions, accessed by all social classes and cultural groups. So chaplains actually really have to be able to address the needs of a very diverse group of people. But in order to, we're talking here about Buddhist chaplaincy, so to untangle it from explicitly Christian definitions, chaplaincy has also become known under the title of spiritual care. So oftentimes chaplains might also refer to themselves as spiritual caregivers because the word chaplain has a particularly kind of association with the Christian clerical tradition. Not that that's a bad thing, but there's a sort of a sense of trying to find good terms that fit the different traditions, Buddhism being one of them. But this idea of spiritual care or becoming or being a spiritual caregiver is considered a vocation that combines theoretical, technical, spiritual, and theological principles, along with intuition and vision. So in some ways, what we talk about at Naropa University is we relate to it as a kind of craft, actually, a sacred craft or a relational craft. And that we are trying to teach our students who are going to go out and represent Buddhism and our institution as spiritual caregivers or chaplains to empower their patients to be able to mediate in ways compassionately in the here and now moments of crisis, transition, and loss. So we're preparing them really as spiritual first responders in some ways, that they're actually going to be in situations where they really have to be right there with people who are in some of the most terrible or worst moments of their lives. And so they really have to be able to draw upon so many different skills. So they're care providers to patients, to their families, to colleagues. So hospital chaplains also tend to the staff. During COVID, we had a number of our students who were doing basically their placement or internship hours in hospitals, and they were doing a tremendous amount of work taking care of the nurses and the doctors during the pandemic. But they're also working within institutionalized healthcare, and there are norms and commitments that they have to navigate in those situations. As well as that, as spiritual or religious caregivers, chaplains are also accountable to their own traditions, cultural beliefs, values, and sometimes a commitment to ethics that may actually challenge other institutional models of care. So there's also a tension there, because you're having to navigate this line of working within the institution, but also the commitment to one's own tradition. So there's a lot of different kinds of skills that need to be cultivated. As clinical and spiritual leaders, chaplains really have to discover ways of conceiving spiritual care that empowers a mutual discovery of meaning with their patients, with the families that they're working with, and interdisciplinary colleagues. Each patient, or care seeker is often the term that's also used, brings richly complex beliefs, values, and practices that may radically differ from the chaplain's own belief system, and may also diverge from medical and counseling models of care. So this is these are all things that chaplains really have to be prepared to navigate and show up. So to give you a brief history of the chaplaincy field in dominant North American healthcare, professional chaplaincy in the US began with groups of male religious leaders supported by predominantly Christian religious communities going into hospitals and healthcare settings. But eventually the benefits of having that kind of presence, a chaplain presence, became professionally recognized. And with that development of professionally recognizing chaplains, there was the need for more specialized training and standards and criteria for that kind of training. So by the 1970s, the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education became the primary provider of clinical training in competencies related to professional chaplaincies. And that group started to work with many different faith groups to work more closely to strengthen standards and opportunities for chaplaincy in many settings. And so with a break from its Protestant Christian roots, persons from all traditions and cultures started to become board-certified chaplains. So in just over half a century, chaplaincy has become a highly recognized and respected profession. Chaplaincy associations have grown into well-organized professional groups, and chaplaincy has evolved in the United States to become very diverse and expansive. Chaplains now come from very diverse spiritual and religious backgrounds, and so there are several different groups in the US serving as major certifying organizations. And while each has its own established requirements, across all of those organizations, all of those currently require the following. So these are the three things that all certifying organizations in the United States currently require to be a board-certified chaplain. So an endorsement by a recognized spiritual or religious organization, so ordination might be one of those. 4 units of what's called clinical pastoral education training, so that's clinical hours, basically, working in a setting and being supervised by a clinical pastoral educator, and a graduate level degree in religious studies or theology. So chaplaincy really continues to grow beyond the boundaries of traditional healthcare, settings to include contexts such as eco-chaplaincy, university chaplains, social movements, even protest and activist groups are now actually having chaplains trained for they're called protest chaplains or activist chaplains. The US military, police departments. So for example, currently in our program, we have a sheriff's deputy from Texas who's training to be a Buddhist chaplain. And we have a number of US military who are also training to be Buddhist chaplains. So it's continuing to grow, and as we start to see this field increase, we see the number of increase, we're actually, the programs that are educating these chaplains, we're starting to see that we need to develop our programs and have some kind of standardization or agreement upon the training, and what, as Buddhist chaplains, do we need to cultivate. So I wanted to, so these are currently US institutions that offer academic degrees and other credentials in which one can become a Buddhist chaplain. Emmanuel College, Harvard Divinity School, Institute of Buddhist Studies, Naropa, the New York. So some of the centers will have certificates. So the Upaya Zen Center, the New York Zen Center, they can offer certificates. But any of the others that are accredited universities can have degree-bearing programs. So this isn't necessarily all of them, but this is most of them. And this is a gathering of a lot of the faculty from those programs. That happened, I think, about 5 or 6 years ago. And there's another one coming up, which I'll tell you about. So the field of Buddhist chaplaincy is growing in the United States, and it's continually evolving. And so several institutions have very, very recently entered into a collaborative agreement to further the field of Buddhist chaplaincy. And this is the list. So it's quite similar to the one before. But in April of this year, all representatives from all of these organizations are going to be meeting at Harvard Divinity School to start a conversation about what kind of criteria we should all agree upon for this training. Because right now what's happening is everyone's doing things a little bit idiosyncratically, a little bit differently, and that doesn't mean that everyone has to do exactly the same thing, but maybe we should have some shared standards, some kind of ways that we can actually define it, because right now it's a little bit like, okay, well, we have them study this or we have them study that, and there are certain things that we think everybody should probably know. So we're hoping, so this is the beginning of it, and then we're hoping that we can actually extend that internationally as well. So stay tuned for that. So that's what I just wanted to give you a kind of a survey of the field. But given this brief survey, the field as it stands now, what are the relevant qualities of the Buddhist path for spiritual caregivers in the settings that I was talking about? What does Buddhism have to offer? What are the challenges and what frameworks need to be developed? So spiritual care involves being a good listener, an encouraging companion, an intelligent guide, and sometimes a piercing truth teller. Overall, the purpose of a Buddhist chaplain is to alleviate suffering in its many forms: physical pain, difficult emotions, agony, fear, anger, depression, loneliness, all of these things. And all of the teachings of the Buddha could be summed up by the phrase, "Nothing should be clung to as me or mine." So interventions of Buddhist chaplains exist to serve this goal, to aid in that kind of realization by providing a skillful guide to alleviating problematic situations which can occur, and through loosening one's grasp on how things should or appear to be, and opening to things as they actually are. So what does Buddhism have to offer in the alleviation of suffering? The Buddha taught that the answer is found through deep insight into the interdependent nature of the world as we experience it. When we look at the world, we do not see things as they are, but rather through the lens of our hopes, fears, and dreams. So this is all the perspective of the Buddhist tradition are some of the lenses through which we're teaching our students to be able to show up and serve. Not necessarily always explicitly, but that this view is really implicit in what you're bringing as a Buddhist chaplain. So the Buddha pointed to this lens as the root of suffering and taught that we each have the potential to awaken from what is imaginary to how things actually are. And so connecting people to that is part of the approach that we're trying to cultivate in the training of our chaplains, in our chaplaincy program. Human beings tend to embrace things as either correct or pleasing, and its opposite, wrong or unsatisfactory. And so those kinds of dualistic distinctions, how maybe a being functions conventionally, can serve on many practical levels, but clinging or aversion to these things can actually cause more suffering. So how do you actually embody that kind of view in all of these settings? So things fall apart, they come together, they fall apart again, they come together again. So if we can see that all objects and mental states are impermanent and without self, there's nothing worth clinging to. And when we stop clinging to or averting things as they are, we experience liberation from suffering. But that isn't necessarily what you might want to tell somebody as a Buddhist chaplain while they're experiencing the worst, maybe one of the worst experiences. But it doesn't mean that we don't feel things or we don't have emotion. But the Buddha taught the truth of dukkha to focus our attention on where maybe the real problem lies, not in the stressfulness of experiences, but the mistake we make into trying to hold on to them. And so the training that we're trying to provide is that we are expecting our students to really embody this view and to be able to radiate that in a way that is actually helpful without shutting somebody down, for example, who might have a reaction to somebody saying, well, you're just clinging to that. So that's a real subtle kind of training to be able to embody that, those teachings. So one of the paradigms for Buddhist chaplaincy that has been proposed by one of my colleagues who's in this working group, Reverend Dr. Monica Sanford, has proposed this form of the Kanya Mitra, or spiritual friendship, as a paradigm for Buddhist chaplains. And she argues that Buddhist chaplains need models that can be universally acceptable to many Buddhist traditions, and that this terminology, this role, which can be translated as the good friend or spiritual friendship, is a paradigm that's valued by Theravadan Buddhist traditions, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. So her book is one of the first comprehensive textbooks for Buddhist chaplains. And her field research shows that Buddhist chaplains are already displaying the qualities and employing the behaviors of spiritual friendship working in interfaith settings. And that these qualities and behaviors can and are intentionally cultivated in the education of Buddhist chaplains, because they need models of spiritual care from within the tradition. Can you guys hear me okay? So the literature on Buddhist chaplaincy, certainly in the United States, remains quite limited. Many scholar practitioners describe the Bodhisattva as an inspirational model. That's something that I'm going to be presenting actually this weekend in a weekend workshop. And while this is an excellent inspirational model and definitely one to explore, this model is limited to Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism, whereas spiritual friendship is a concept that Theravadan, Mahayana, and Vajrayana Buddhists all value. So it appears in the Pali Canon, it appears in the Prajnaparamita literature, the works of Shantideva, as well as Lojong and mind training texts. So the texts themselves contain very pragmatic guidance about the qualities and behaviors of spiritual friendship and this role in the path to awakening. And this is what certainly Dr. Sanford believes to be part of Buddhist spiritual care praxis. So one of the most often quoted passages from the Pali Canon is the Upada Sutta, in which Ananda is conversing with the Buddha. I'm not going to read the entire sutta, because if you've read suttas, they can be quite repetitive. I don't need to read it in long, but it's basically, in this discourse, the Buddha says, Ananda, it may be understood how the entire holy life is good friendship, companionship, good comradeship. By relying upon me as a good friend, it may be understood how the entire holy life is good friendship, companionship, and camaraderie. So here we can see that the Buddha identifies himself as a spiritual friend. And this identity is expanded throughout the Pali Canon to apply to any friend, be they a fellow monk, a nun, layperson, teacher, or supporter, anyone who causes wholesome qualities to arise and unwholesome qualities to decrease, and advances one towards spiritual fulfillment. So several modalities for spiritual friends have been identified in the sacred literature and modern Buddhist teachings, including a spiritual friend as a peer, a teacher or guru, a lay supporter, or a moral exemplar. And some of these modalities are better suited to chaplaincy than others. The paradigm of teacher can be problematic in the context of chaplaincy, despite that being a primary modality in which many Buddhist clergies are trained. So many Buddhist chaplains in the United States recommend that the role of peer is the most beneficial as a model of spiritual friend in chaplaincy. So one who accompanies rather than leads isn't teaching or preaching so much as accompanying. This doesn't mean that the Buddhist chaplain shouldn't rely upon their expertise, but in spiritual care, that expertise is employed to facilitate, support, and explore the care seeker's own spiritual wisdom. And actually, if you look at the sutta material, the suttas in the Pali Canon, the Buddha himself often models this, particularly when he's addressing those who are not his students. There's many, many suttas where the Buddha is addressing villagers who've come to ask him a question. He doesn't even teach them the Four Noble Truths. He always, there's a model there where he accompanies or leads people towards their own integration, towards their own understanding, their own natural intelligence and capacity. So we can see this very much in the Theravadan tradition, in the foundational Buddhist scriptures and texts. In the Prajnaparamita literature, bodhisattvas are also identified as spiritual friends, and the perfection of wisdom and the other paramitas are also considered spiritual friends. So we start to see how in the Pali Canon, spiritual friend refers to literally a human person, but in Mahayana literature, it also applies to the Dharma teachings themselves. In Vajrayana literature, spiritual friend can be a way to describe a level of teacher with whom a practitioner has a deep connection. Now in Vajrayana, you can understand spiritual teacher or teacher on three different levels. So the first one could be understood as the preceptor, a teacher who provides teachings, provides a remedy for the pain and difficulty of life. A preceptor is one who gives the teachings, drawing particularly from foundational Buddhist teachings and Mahayana teachings, as a way of beginning to shift one's context for understanding the difficulties of one's own life, from suffering, things that you can work with and begin to realize the true nature of an awakened quality of human life. The second level of teacher is called the spiritual friend, and this is someone who's like meditation instructor who works with a student over a period of time, really listening to their worries and concerns and also challenges on the path, but developing a kind of friendship, holding the student with understanding, and supporting the best parts of those students to move along the path. And then, of course, you have the third level of teacher, which is the guru, the Vajrayana guru. And this is a much more deep and rare, special kind of relationship that has what's called samaya. So this is only entered into once one has developed the relationship or preceptor or spiritual friend with the teacher. So the Vajrayana guru transmits the intuitive teachings of the Vajrayana that cannot often be understood with a rational mind. And it involves entering a commitment onto the path, doing subtle advanced practices. And this kind of relationship requires incredible trust in the teacher and the student. So in this context, we're not referring to the Vajrayana guru as the model of spiritual friend. It's really that second level of accompanying and leading. And so that is the model in the Vajrayana context. But also this idea of spiritual friend in the Vajrayana is also described in Vajrayana texts as a mental construct to aid in the development of skillful views. So in such scriptures, there are found instructions for who to regard as a friend, all beings, who to regard as an enemy, our own self-grasping, and even what qualities within ourselves, altruistic ones, to address as friends, and what qualities we shouldn't, which are selfish ones. So while each branch of Buddhism has different inflections, they all value this role of spiritual friend and provide clear descriptions that can be a beneficial model for Buddhist chaplains. And the applications involved in accompanying a care seeker as a spiritual friend while respecting the care seeker's religious tradition and aiding in spiritual growth. So this is certainly a model that I think is definitely been talked about a lot, and I owe a lot to Monica Sanford for her excellent work on this. So I would definitely refer you to many of the works that she has where she's talking about these models for Buddhist chaplains to emulate. So what are some of the challenges? Buddhist chaplains are coping themselves with anxiety, depression, overwhelm, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue. This is something that's talked about a lot. Threat of burnout. So it's essential to also train chaplains well. Of course, it's essential for chaplains to be trained well and care for others, but they also must be trained in self-care. And yet, at the same time, we're talking about Buddhist teachings on loosening the grasp on self, which is also of benefit. So you have this interesting kind of dynamic of self-care while you're teaching them to understand not to grasp the self. Many Buddhist chaplains who've been through extensive degree programs experience and draw from either implicitly or explicitly, depending on the context of Dharmic principles of selflessness, non-self, and emptiness, and interdependence, but actually find that those teachings that they've learned theologically, but also in applied ways and in the process of meditation practices, have found that actually these teachings on selflessness, emptiness, and interdependence are actually incredibly helpful in terms of developing the kind of resiliency to be able to show up and work with these kinds of issues. Particularly during the pandemic and during COVID, there were huge amounts of this in healthcare settings, particularly doctors, nurses, all those kind of care providers. And the feedback that we got during that time, we had a number of our chaplaincy students working in local hospitals. The feedback we got was that was overwhelmingly the doctors and nurses just were actually kind of amazed by the resiliency of our chaplains and how much they helped them. And they weren't explicitly teaching Buddhism, but they were radiating it. They were showing up, they were embodying these teachings. They'd been able to integrate it for themselves, and then they were able to kind of show up. And it had an effect on all of the hospitals that we had our chaplains in. So it's anecdotal evidence, but I think that there's something to be learned from this. So Buddhist spiritual care training emphasizes an in-depth understanding of contemplative Buddhist teachings in historical and present-day contexts, instruction in Buddhist practice as a foundation for compassionate and wise spiritual caregiving. So what kind of key theological teachings and concepts provide models for chaplains and caregivers? We've talked about the spiritual friend, but what kinds of teachings should be taught? What kind of applied skills are essential? What kind of contemplative development is beneficial? So hopefully I will have, okay, so training. So to explore and understand meditative practices, there are certain kind of outcomes that we've developed at Naropa, which I'm going to share with you some of the kind of ways that we are developing our training. Some of the program learning outcomes that we have include formulating a theological identity that is informed by an in-depth knowledge of the teachings of Buddhism in its cultural and historical context, an understanding of multiple religious traditions and practices, ability and practice of interspiritual or interreligious dialogue and contemporary spiritual and religious phenomena, to explore and understand meditative practices theoretically and experientially in both Buddhism and other traditions, and understanding their integral part in their respective traditions. So that includes all different kinds of Buddhist traditions, but also other spiritual traditions as well, because in the US, the chaplains that we're training, they have to be able to have some understanding of a very, very diverse religious landscape. But also to be able to develop their own personal spiritual journey, to actually develop their own kind of theological identity and spiritual formation. So these are some of the program learning outcomes that we have for our Buddhist chaplaincy, our chaplaincy program. So we can understand this training that has an emphasis in 4 key areas. So I'm just going to go through these 4 key areas and give you an example of the kinds of trainings and things that we do in these areas. So the first one is theological study. So this is an in-depth understanding of contemplative Buddhist teachings in historical and present-day contexts. So these theological courses are, they intend to develop a student's understanding of Buddhist psychology and worldview, particularly its presentation of how we create painful mental states and reverse them to experience non-dual equanimity, well-being and compassion action. That's actually a program learning outcome that we have in our university, which is how you assess that is also, that's the whole interesting question, because when we're assessing the students, how do they demonstrate all of these things? That's another talk entirely, because there's a lot there. But so this is an example of the courses that our students have to take that fulfills the theological requirements. So there are 3 required courses. They're called the turnings of the wheel. So they have the first turning, second turning, third turning. So the first turning course introduces the early discourses of the Buddha, so the Pali Canon, the Abhidharma distillation of the Buddhist teachings on the nature, structure, and operation of the mind and emotions. And they learn a selected survey of essential text from the Northern Vaibhashika and Southern Theravadan schools, along with historical context and applications to meditation practice. So I'll talk a little bit about the meditation piece in a minute, but alongside the theological content, they are taking applied courses, they're taking interspiritual dialogue kind of courses, but they're also doing meditation practicums. And each meditation practicum is designed to go along with each of these components. So they'll be learning meditation practices associated with these different contexts. So for example, in the first turning of the wheel, meditation practicum 1 focuses mostly on mindfulness practice, shamatha, vipassana, but mostly mindfulness and shamatha. So very simple and metta kind of practices. So the students will begin there. And then they move into they have the option of taking an Abhidhamma course, and then there's another meditation practicum that is analytical meditation, analyzing self and non-self. I need my glasses for this. Remember where I am. So the second turning is Mahayana teachings on the Bodhisattva path, with the examination of philosophical view, meditation, practice, and compassionate action of the Bodhisattva path. So students study the Prajnaparamita, Vimalakirti Sutras, Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, and finally they're taught about philosophically and historically the view of emptiness presented in the work of Nagarjuna's Root Verses of the Middle Way and some of its commentaries. And then in the third turning orientation, they are introduced to the Yogacara school and the teachings on Buddha nature, which emphasizes meditation and the dynamics of emptiness. And they read from core sutras such as the Samdhini Mochana Sutra, the Uttara Tantra Shastra, as well as commentaries from Asanga, Vasubandhu, and others. So these are the theological courses which are intended to develop a student's understanding of Buddhist psychology, the view, but it's designed to take them through, it's really designed to take them through in a very structured way with historical context and philosophical context, but at the same time, they're also learning meditation practices that go along with these. Then they have the option of elective courses. So we have Buddhism in Tibet, we have Buddhist Tantra in India and Tibet. We also have a course on Hindu Tantra, so some students actually decide to take both of those at the same time. Zen Buddhism, Theravadan Buddhism, and Buddhism in Modernity. So these are electives that they can choose from. So depending upon their particular interest in Buddhism, they can go one of a few ways. And if you have more curiosity about what's taught in Buddhism and Modernity, you can ask me because I teach that one. I'll share my whole syllabus with you if you like. So then the next area is socially engaged spiritual leadership and professional formation that affirms the potential for spiritual care to foster transformative healing for persons and communities in crisis. So to contribute to the students' formation of a theological identity and to help them develop their own spiritual journey and their chaplaincy skills, there's a number of courses that they also have to take. So we have clinical pastoral education or field education, so one of the two. Clinical pastoral education is one that is certified. Field education is not. Sometimes there are students that they might be doing something that's quite unusual and there isn't a kind of CPE site that we can certify for them, that they want to go in and do something. So we had up until recently, eco-chaplaincy was a little bit like that, but we're actually now getting to the point where we have some places that you can be certified eco-chaplain. There's a few other, some of our students, Naropa, we definitely attract some unusual students, and so they can be quite different, and they come with very interesting ideas, and so we try to help them, but sometimes we might have to direct them to field education because we can't certify things that are quite unconventional yet. Anyway, so clinical pastoral education is an experiential method of learning that it brings chaplaincy students into supervised encounters with persons in crisis. So it's it's kind of with chaplaincy with the training wheels on. So there are people who are supervising. We don't just send our students and go, right, go to the emergency room and help people. So we give them an opportunity to develop their skills through, and so they will also attend lectures. We have a particular certified educator in clinical pastoral education who will supervise them, but they also have supervisors on site. And they learn all kinds of techniques, skills, and awareness they need to practice spiritual care. And so they also have to do their own work in terms of techniques and skills, their own family origin dynamics. They need to understand some of that. They need to actually work with themselves quite a lot. So there's a kind of counseling approach here where they actually have to go through and process some of their own, sometimes some of their own trauma, sometimes some of their own, they might come from difficult family backgrounds. So we actually, we're helping them work through those things so that if they're presented with a situation that might trigger something, that they actually are prepared for that. So they're assigned to clinical or community placements, places like hospices, hospitals, sometimes religious communities, non-profits. We've had a number of students who have gone to prisons, and they've done their CPE in some of the prisons in Colorado, and police departments. We have a lot of different sites that we can place people. And usually the students themselves will identify a place, and then we'll check with the educator to see if it's an appropriate place, if there's somebody who's willing to supervise them. So then another course we have that they have to take, so these are basically all of the applied courses that the students have to take. Contemplative communication it's building a foundation for ethical practice and spiritual care, but different ways of communicating. So there's a lot of practice on listening, actually different kinds of what we call interlistening, different kinds of communication to develop skills and attitudes for people in crisis. So listening isn't just about hearing the words that people are saying, but it's paying attention to body language. It's understanding what terms they're using. It's sort of like what's in between what they're saying. So these are all really important. I'm sure as counselors, if any, all of you in Buddhist counseling will understand how important it is to train in how to listen to people, not just what they're saying, but what's actually happening with their whole body as well. So it's like picking up on all of those things. And so they practice with each other, and they move from that then into contemplative communication is the first thing that they learn, and then they go into introduction to spiritual care. So the very first thing that we teach them is actually how to learn about communication, which I think everyone could actually benefit from this course. I think a lot of times so many things that are misunderstood, or a lot of conflict can come from people not actually understanding how to communicate or listen to each other. So the other thing that we do, which they have every semester, is what we call integration labs. And these are small group process, usually no more than about 7 or 8 students per lab. So for example, we have a cohort of 35, we'll have to have 3 or 4 different labs as small groups. So it's just a time for them to have individual reflection, they have mentoring. It's meant to be a place of integration of personal, theoretical learning, but a place to just actually unpack what they're learning, because this is very difficult training. A lot of students come and they're very inspired to come, and then they realize what hard work it is to become a chaplain, that you actually have to do a lot of work on yourself. And some students decide to take a break, and they'll go off for a year or 2 and they'll come back. That struck the chord there, yeah. But it's hard work. This isn't easy. This is different than all kind of study is hard, but to to really work on yourself so that you can be there for somebody else is incredibly brave, and it requires a lot of personal processing, a lot of understanding of yourself, and that can be painful. So we have these labs so that they can actually come and have a place to kind of let go, process, rant and rave, cry, whatever you need to do, but don't hold it in, right? So just actually have a place where you can start to, just be able to not kind of let that solidify. So then the other thing, obviously we have ethics and spiritual caregiving. So there's all sorts of diverse contexts in the United States with particular focus on professional boundaries, what kind of ethics, in complex ethical dilemmas in healthcare. In the United States, there's all sorts of things around physician-assisted dying, end-of-life decision-making. There's actually a burgeoning field now of psychedelic-assisted therapy and psychedelic chaplaincy. And so there is a number of states in the US, Colorado being one of them, that has legalized psilocybin, certain psychedelic substances, for use in therapeutic and chaplaincy settings. And there's a huge ethical dilemma here. And really, really important to actually be able to train people properly, because it could be incredibly dangerous. So these are all things that we actually have to address in some of these courses, because there are people setting themselves up as psychedelic therapists who are not trained, are just putting posters up around and inviting people, and this is very, very, very scary. So it's really important that we have this ethical background. Another really important training is a course we have on death, dying, and mourning. Chaplains, one of the big tasks of chaplains is to attend people in the dying process, but also to tend to those left behind as well. And so we have, some of our students have actually have this as their particular focus. So their particular focus is almost like death midwives, they almost call it. So like the process of helping somebody to be born is similar to helping them die. So we have themes that include caring for the terminally ill, the role that chaplains play in supporting mourning practices, which is different, and different traditions and different religious traditions have very specific things that are meant to happen or not happen when someone passes away. And so having the knowledge of knowing what to do in those moments to show up, but also how to assist people in the dying process. And so we invite teachers from many diverse traditions into this course. So we have Buddhist teachers, we have Sufi teachers, so we have Muslim teachers, Jewish teachers, we have representatives from a lot of different traditions to teach the students actually how to assist in these areas, because you might have somebody who's a Buddhist chaplain, but they're serving in a hospital and they have to tend to many, many different groups. And then we have what we call spiritual teaching, formation, and ritual arts. I was talking today, I can't remember, we talked a lot today, we went to a lot of places today, but there was, you have a course in homiletics, is that, yeah. So this course used to be part of a course that we called homiletics, and then we changed the name. I did to change it to Dharma talks, and then people said that wasn't appropriate. So what we've done is combined this course into spiritual teaching and formation, spiritual formation and ritual arts. So it's how to deliver talks, how to facilitate dialogue, small group teaching methods, larger speaking, but also how to work with the body and how to present rituals. So I think you might have a ritual course as well, yeah. So it's, we're training the students into how to conduct weddings, funerals, blessings, rites of passage, these kinds of things. So it's ways to equip them because they have to learn how to, they really actually have to understand ritual. The purpose of ritual and the presence that's needed actually to conduct a ritual, because it isn't just like, okay, let's just do this kind of thing. You have to show up. You have to be embodied. So we actually have a lot of what you would call somatic training in these courses as well. And then we have the capstone, which is their version of a thesis. This is a requirement of the program, and it's a final integrative project. Students are meant to integrate coursework, construct and really demonstrate their theological formation and view, and to draw upon the whole range of what they're learning. So the theological content, the applied skills, interspiritual dialogue and meditation and contemplative practice. So they do, there's many, it's a very creative. We have a lot of very creative students in our program. We have a number of students that have done projects that are autoethnography, so it's actually an ethnographic journey of their own, of themselves and where they come from. But we have, right now, we have a student who comes from this sort of hippie festival counterculture kind of movement, and she's doing all kinds of interesting things where she wants to be a chaplain at music festivals. So she's constructing all these kind of interactive things with stickers and things that people can connect. So there's like a lot of different things. At Naropa, we're very creative university. So we basically try to kind of encourage and bring out the brilliance of all of our students in whatever way can be of benefit. So we're definitely unconventional place, but we've also produced some incredibly brilliant students that have really innovated. So the next, how am I doing on time? I'm okay? Okay. So the next is into spiritual care. And so these are also required courses. So every student has to take a course in interspiritual dialogue. And actually one of the things that we often do is we invite students from a Christian seminary in Denver, and they come and have a dialogue with our students. So we have a training. So it's good for both of us, right? So we have this kind of dialogue that happens. And we often take our students to the World Parliament of Religions. It's still going, actually. So we often take them to, if we can get enough support from alumni to sponsor it, we take them to the World Parliament of Religions and we let them kind of explore. And then we have a course on power, privilege, and diversity. So this is certainly, this is a very difficult topic in US universities, and particularly in the United States at the moment, because there is such a polarization around race in the United States at the moment. There's such a big, painful conversation about racial diversity, power dynamics, that we have to train our students to be able to navigate those things and be able to have sensitivity and understanding. And so this is a required course across all of our programs that have, particularly those that have applied career paths like chaplaincy and counseling, psychology. And then they're electives. They're expected to take electives in other religious traditions. So our department is called the Department of Wisdom Traditions. I say religious studies because most places know religious studies, but we actually call our department Wisdom Traditions. And every faculty member in our department has to be a practitioner of the tradition that they teach. So you're not just expected to be an academic, you actually have to be a practitioner. And so when you apply for a job in our department, you actually have to show not just all your academic publications, but how many retreats you've done, who's your teacher, what's your experience of meditation. And when we're assessed, when we go through our promotion processes, we have to show not just all our publications, but how have we developed our contemplative practice, how are we offering our expertise in contemplative practice to the community, how are we developing that in ourselves. So all of our courses on Judaism are taught by a rabbi. We have a Sufi master who teaches Sufism. We have, but they're all scholars as well. So it's actually quite hard to hire faculty in our department because to have the requisite academic skills, but also the deep contemplative practice and knowledge is quite rare. So our faculty meetings are very interesting. Sometimes we start with somebody leads a practice first, so you get to learn all these kind of wonderful different things. So all of our students have to take electives. So they might take a course in the history and philosophy of the Hindu tradition, or they might take contemplative Judaism or contemplative Islam. All of those courses involve learning some practices associated with that tradition. And then we have another course on contemporary religious movements, because in the United States there's a lot of different kinds of religious movements that you might encounter as a chaplain, particularly in hospitals. So we have in the United States, there are small religious communities that definitely have their own specific beliefs, rituals, practices, and application in certain situations. So, for example, in Utah, you have the Mormon religion, so there's particular ways that they have their belief systems that you might have to, at least you have to understand if you're a chaplain. So this class provides some analysis and survey of all sorts of different religious communities, and also students visit local religious communities and learn more about them from those communities themselves. So then we have, finally, practice and meditation. This has a green thing, right? Which was is it this top one? Yeah. I'm just saying it because this is my office right there. I'm just pointing it out. So this is Naropa campus. This is our library. We're very small. We're not like Hong Kong University where you get lost every time you come on this campus. Well, at least I do. But this is our main campus. This is our library. That's my office. When it's sunny and beautiful outside, we'll have classes outside. We'll do meditation practice together. And this, our university was founded by a Tibetan teacher, and so it was founded on Buddhist principles, and the site itself was chosen for its tree. So this is a sycamore tree, and these don't normally grow in Colorado. So it's a very special tree, and so it had a kind of significance, and so we really tried to take care of it, sort of like if the Bodhi tree starts dropping its leaves, you kind of get worried. So we take care of our sycamore tree. And this is one of the shrine rooms that we have on our campus. So these are always open. We have classes and practices in here. but it's also open to the public, and somebody from our community, sometimes it's students, sometimes it's faculty, once a week will we'll just go and sit, and whoever wants to come in, so from the public, and they'll give meditation instructions. So it's a kind of open place. So it's always open. Students can go in there anytime, but we also have particular practices that we do. So practice and meditation, instruction in Buddhist and other forms of spiritual practice, contemplative practices are a really important part of our training. So we have 4 meditation practicums that are designed to go along with the theological content. So in the meditation practicums 1 and 2, students are introduced to sitting meditation practice, mindfulness practices. They have lectures that emphasize experiential aspects of the practice, working with emotions, and then they're directed to, in meditation practicum 2, analytical meditation on self and no self. So these courses accompany the students' theological journey and correspond with what they learn in the philosophical, historical, and psychological courses. So meditation and practicums include weekly discussion groups, individual meetings with a meditation instructor, and it requires the students to engage in and track a daily meditation practice. So this is something that we require of all the students, and when we interview them, we ask them if they're ready to commit to that level. So meditation practicum 3 emphasizes Mahayana practice, so that's designed to go along with the second turning of the wheel, second and third turning of the wheel courses. And that includes generation of bodhicitta, practice around the trainings of the paramitas, mind training, lojong, tonglen practices. So based on a lot of the Indian and Tibetan traditions, they will learn those practices. And then we have a very unique meditation practicum 4, which is called Maitri. And this is based on a mandala practice, but this is a kind of Vajrayana type meditation practicum, but doesn't include any kind of empowerment, or it's a kind of adapted practice from Vajrayana traditions that was developed by the founder of our university, and it has psychological components to it. So it is a sequence that emphasizes the mandala principle and the 5 Buddha families, and how to work with the wisdom and the neurosis of the 5 Buddha families. And it's a very interesting practice for me as a scholar, because it's based on some of the highest teachings, but it's been designed in a way that's very, very accessible. So students are introduced to the 5 Buddha families and their qualities, and we actually have a kind of lab on our campus with the colors and the shapes of the 5 Buddha families, and the students go through them. So we have a Buddha room that's white, and then we have Karma that's green, and Vajra blue. And they go, and so the whole room is that color. And they have very specific meditation postures that go with each family. And so they're working with the neurotic qualities. So for example, the Vajra family is associated with the kind of poison of anger, but then it's transformed into discriminating wisdom. And so they will go through these practices where they will work with each one, and they reflect on it, and they write papers. I always know what family they're working with when they come to my class, because I'm like, all right, you guys are working with anger this week, I can tell. Or if it's Buddha, they're really spacey. So it's a very, very deep experiential practice, and something that was very, very unique. Whenever we have visitors who come, particularly from Asia, they're always incredibly interested in this practice, because it has this kind of combination of, I would say, Eastern and Western knowledge together. But so they have to do this so they do this in 5 differently colored rooms, and that intensifies different emotional and psychological states. So the wisdom state and the confused state. So they get to experience that, both in the context of like personal awareness, and it's a way of recognizing one's own patterns, but it's also a way of recognizing patterns in others, so you know how to respond to other people. The other part is that all of our students are required to do 1 month of retreat. This is usually broken up into weeks, but throughout the program they have to do a retreat requirement. So we have 3 weeks of that is led by us, by our department. So all of us in our department, faculty, staff, excuse me, faculty, staff, and students, we go to a retreat center up in the mountains. It's about 2 hours north of our campus, and we'll spend an entire week doing practice together. And then they have 1 week that they can do within their own tradition. They're not allowed to graduate until they've shown that they've completed those retreats. So along with their meditation practicums, their own daily meditation or contemplative practice, they also have to commit to doing this 1 month retreat. This is actually arguably, to me anyway, one of the most important components of chaplaincy training, which is, are they able to actually sit? Are they able to actually sit with their own experience, with their own minds? Because, certainly the first retreat, it's actually really cute, but you can see everyone is fidgeting, and you can see people actually start to have things come up in the first few days that they actually haven't realized, like, how deeply they need to work on something. And this is actually part of also, because we have our Master of Divinity, we have an in-person program, but we also have an online program. And we will not certify anyone as a chaplain until we've seen them in person and we've sat with them for a week. It's really important, though, because if you're sending somebody out to tend to those who are going through significant crisis, you have to we have an ethical responsibility to make sure that they can do it, both for themselves and the people that they want to help. So this is actually it's something that we actually fight a lot with the university administration about, because they kind of want to, it costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of resources to do this, and so we're constantly having to defend this. But it's absolutely essential from our perspective of the faculty to have that kind of requirement. And then the other thing that we do is that in our university, every semester, we have a community week and we have a practice day, and the entire university shuts down and everyone goes to, we have one big building and everyone goes and sits and does contemplative practice meditation together. All the staff, all the faculty, all the students, the caretakers, the gardeners, everybody. The whole university, we just have one day and we all sit together. We have lunch together and we do practice together. So no formal classes are held during that time. So that's an overview of how we are kind of doing. This is how we're doing our training. Oh. There we go. So compassion is everything in terms of how we are approaching how we're training our students. Compassion can be defined as a liberation from the illusion of separateness. It enhances our appreciation for things, for each other, and it allows us to awaken to our true nature. Buddhist chaplains are motivated by loving kindness and opening of the heart through spiritual practice, and the characteristics are compassion towards and equanimity amongst and sympathetic joy for others. So Buddhist chaplains' goal, like the qualities to be cultivated, so that Buddhist chaplains can serve as capable, steady companions who have investigated their own experiences and suffering, and from that perspective, from that place of knowing, they can embody the spirit of awakening and the stability of mind as models for the possibility of healing, awakening, and hopefully transformation. So spiritual support from a Buddhist perspective you could define as a willingness to bear witness, a willingness to help others discover their own truth, a willingness to sit and listen, to help others face suffering directly and bravely, welcoming paradox and ambiguity, trusting that these will emerge into some degree of awakening, and creating opportunities for people to awaken to their natural intelligence and basic goodness. So Buddhist spiritual care means helping people access the clarity and love in their hearts and letting there be room for everything to happen, room for grief, room for misery, but also room for joy. So one of the titles or names to which the Buddha is referred in Buddhist text is Tathagata. And this is often translated as thus gone, meaning one that's gone beyond. The suffering, right, has gone beyond the suffering of old age, sickness, and death. But this term has a complex meaning in Sanskrit, since it can also be, or it's related to a word that indicates one who is genuinely present. So holding these meanings together, we can see that this term indicates boundlessness and fluidity, and one such as the Buddha radiates the qualities of liberation, but strikes a balance between authentic presence and non-attachment. And that is the model being aimed at in Buddhist spiritual care. So I just want to finish with this Shantideva prayer, which is an inspiration for us as we train our Buddhist chaplains. So I want to stop there and say thank you very much for listening to me. And I want to invite any questions that you might have for me. So, thank you. Don't be shy.
Hi, Professor. In your class, how many intakes are international students coming to US want to be trained as a chaplain, and how many are the US students?
Yes. So how many international students? Maybe when we have the questions, you can give the microphone to people. Yeah. But I'll repeat your question. So you were asking how many international students? So master in our chaplaincy program, or at Naropa? In the chaplaincy program. So we have our in-person program. We accept between 10 to 15 students in a cohort. And then we have an online program where we'll accept 25 to 30. I would say that probably we get more students, international students, for the online program because it's just easier for them. Where Boulder is very expensive to live and it's hard to, so I would say probably 20% of the online students are international. Less so for the in-person, but we usually have one or two international students. One of the things about our program at Naropa is that we have a monastic scholarship. So we provide for one cohort, so it would be for 3 years, we provide one full scholarship for Buddhist monastics, but then we also we work with particular foundations to support Asian monastics coming to our program. So in any given time, we might have 3 or 4 Asian Buddhist monastics in person to come, but we also do have some online as well.
Hi, Dr. Hall. Thank you for a very great presentation. So, as you're aware of our Buddhist counseling program, so which made me think, curious about your perspective. What would you think would be the similarities and differences between a Buddhist chaplain and a counselor using Buddhist teaching in the practice?
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit about this earlier. So, and I was thinking about this because one of the things is is the cultural context and the geographical differences. So at Naropa, we have an entire school of counseling and psychology. So we're also training Buddhist counselors. In the United States, that's heavily licensed. It's actually much more strict in terms of certification to be a licensed counselor. much more strict than a chaplaincy program is. So for us in the United States, there's a very different pathway because of the requirements that are needed for licensed therapists or counselors. So, and we have a Buddhist a degree in Buddhist psychology, but we also have different pathways. So we have somatic, transpersonal psychology. We have mindfulness-based counseling program, and so each one of those has its own licensure procedures, as well as very strict rules about who can teach, what the qualifications of the people who teach are. So that's much more regulated than chaplaincy is. Chaplaincy, we're working with one or two certifying bodies, and we can have more flexibility. So we can say, for example, if we have a Buddhist teacher, we have somebody who's a monastic, who's been a monastic for 25 years, they could use their experience as equivalencies. They wouldn't necessarily have to take certain things because they would, the certification board would recognize that as an equivalency. But if they wanted to be a counselor, they would have to go through all of the procedures. I understand that that's probably different here. But I would say that in terms of the actual differences, that my perspective is that chaplaincy is much more sort of like you're in the ambulance, you're kind of a first responder, you're in the emergency room. You're not providing long-term, you might be, if you're working in a hospice, you might be working with, a patient who's passing away, a terminally ill patient, but you're not doing the same kind of long-term work necessarily that a counselor might be doing. You're in the moment, right? So, it's almost like a kind of, like you're like a firefighter or a police officer or something. Like you actually have to be, you don't have time to be like, oh, I'll just sit and have a cup of tea before I kind of talk to this person, or let's just have, you might have to respond. So the training, I think there's some differences in that training. I think there's a lot of crossover for sure in these trainings, but anyway, what do you have any observations?
In a way, what you said reminds me of a physician who work in private practice versus a physician working in ER.
Yes, right. That's a good analogy. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I have another question.
Okay.
As you know, we train a lot of Buddhist counseling students. I'm
Yeah.
just wondering, in all your years of teaching, what might be some of the most challenging situations or problems that you have encountered, and how do you cope with them?
In teaching?
In training Buddhist
In
chaplains.
training?
Yeah, in training.
One of the challenges is when you know that somebody's not ready, and they have the heart and they have the aspiration, but you just know that they're not ready. And people, certainly in the United States, to come and do, to go to do a master's degree, it costs a lot of money. Oftentimes students have huge loans that they take out, and so there's a kind of market pressure to kind of like, got to get this done. And the university wants us to kind of graduate students, right? But from my perspective, it's like, you're not ready. I'm not, I don't want, I ethically, I just don't feel like, so that's the challenge, is to be able to have those conversations when a student says, well, I might have to like not pass them in a class, or say, no, we're not going to let you do CPE yet. You're going to have to wait a year. And they have, there's all sorts of pressures that they're working with, and I understand that, but it is, assessing somebody, and the assessment of it, how you actually, like, I don't know if you have to do this here, but in the US, we have to provide assessment reports to our accrediting body. So there's the way that because we receive federal funding, we have to send assessment reports of all of our programs to what's called the Higher Learning Commission, that allows us to have an accredited program and also receive federal financial aid for students, and how you write an assessment report on somebody's contemplative practice is really challenging. You know, do they have they understand non-duality? Like, you know, how do you, so we constantly struggle with the sort of definitions of how we navigate the sort of conventionalities and bureaucracies, whilst, you know, trying to put out graduates who are going to go out and help. So those are some of the challenges that I find. And I'll just say practically organizing the retreats is challenging. When you take 50 students and 10 faculty on a 7-day retreat, and I was, as the chair of the program, that's challenging. Yeah, thank you. Anyone? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. Really enjoyed it. You mentioned the racial issue in the U.S., which is getting worse.
Yeah.
Especially hate crimes against Asians.
Yes.
My family lives in New York,
Yeah.
so I kind of know, from firsthand.
Yeah.
I just wonder what you do specifically to prepare your students to face that issue, especially, they represent an Asian religion.
Mm-hmm.
So when they go out to meet people, who need the help,
Yeah.
and do they get any pushback just because they're kind of promoting Buddhist concepts, even though the students themselves may not be Asian?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, good question. So there's a lot of complexity to this, because when you're talking about things like, race, power, privilege, diversity, there's so many intersecting things, because you can also talk about misogyny, patriarchy, all kinds of different intersecting ways that people experience marginalization. So we have a very, very diverse group of students. One of the things that we do is when in the interview process, we actually have a series of questions that we ask them, which is what their level of comfortability and knowledge is around these issues. And then are they willing to explore them? Are they willing to do the work based on, because, it could be, when we talk about privilege, you're talking about so many different people on a different spectrum. There's some people on a very cushy end, and there's some people on a very sharp end of that. And people experience, advantages and disadvantages in whatever body they're in. And so we have certain questions that we ask during the interview process, and then we ask them to make a commitment to, one is to this course, the course that we do, where they have to explore those, and they have to work through scenarios and have difficult conversations. You may have heard this term safe space that's sort of used a lot in the United States. We tried to change that into brave space rather than safe space, because it's actually like, actually you need to kind of show up and have difficult conversations. And we are trying our best to make sure that we are training our students to be sensitive to all of these difficult issues that are happening, because it's an interesting country. I'm not from the United States originally. I'm from the UK. I'm not used to being in a country that has so many guns, for example, and we have a lot of gun crime, particularly in Colorado. We've had several mass shootings in Colorado, and so the difficulties that come with a society that has that conflict, but also then you start to add weapons into that, is really tricky, and hospitals responding to those things. So one of the issues that we've often, that our students have experienced, particularly when we have students that come from, let's say, areas of the country that are very, very dominated by Christianity. So places like they call it the Bible Belt. So we have had students that have tried to introduce Buddhist perspectives in a very gentle, kind of secular way into prisons, and have had a lot of pushback. Teaching yoga or even mindfulness practice. So we had one student. He did a really beautiful capstone project on his work in a prison in a very conservative Christian area of the United States, and how he was trying to lead a group with the population, the incarcerated population, just in basic principles of basic goodness. Because from the Buddhist perspective, you have this sense of you have a view of like everyone is basically good. There's an inherent quality of the Buddha in all beings, which is very different from was being taught in that prison, which was original sin, right? And so him having to navigate that very skillfully, because the prison staff, the local community were very distrustful that they were teaching witchcraft or something. It was that level. But people really do. People are. There's fear, ignorance and fear are very intertwined, right? And so we actually have to learn to develop skill and compassion as well in those situations, because, for example, right now we have a student who's working in a hospital, again in a very conservative area, and most of the people that she's being a chaplain to and working with have a political viewpoint that is radically different than her own. But she still has to tend to, that her job is to tend to them, so we have to teach our students that your job is to actually help people. It's not, you can embody these things, but it isn't about imposing. But that's a really subtle level, which is also why sometimes, I struggle, because I think they're not ready. They think they are, but they're not ready to go and show up for people. Whether it's through arrogance, or then, they have ignorance, or they're still triggered by things, Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Hall. Yeah, be here.
Oh, there you are. Oh, sorry.
Just small. Yeah, and thank you for your wonderful sharing. And I recall that you have mentioned that for the Buddhist chaplaincy, for the Buddhist chaplains, some of them are working in the military settings, right?
Yes.
And that I will pop up immediately is about the ethical dilemma.
Yes.
Yes. So I'm just wonder how you're going to resolve from the agency level, because we hire you, or we request for the service of the Buddhist chaplaincy. I suppose you're not going to turn everyone away because of the compassion, and then they will quit their job. I'm not sure. And then on the other hand, for the client level, they are falling into also some dilemma. Maybe they will have some guilty feelings in killing people, and then they ask for help from the Buddhist chaplains. And also for our own oneself, we are also in an ethical dilemmas too, right? So how do you going to face all these things in different levels? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So my understanding of your question is the kind of ethical challenges of training to be a Buddhist chaplain in the U.S. military, or is in a military setting.
Also in practically, sometimes you may have all these dilemmas, right?
Yeah.
How we are going to face this.
Yeah. So we have a number of U.S. currently active U.S. military who are enrolled in our program, and they go through in the ethics course. They have to do a lot of reflection on what that means to be in the military. Most of them are not engaged in the kind of frontline activities, you know. So they're not, you know, they're not soldiers necessarily, but they're serving. So like some of the conversations we have are about, you know, intention. So if your intention of being in the military is to protect, to serve and protect, that's actually a very big sacrifice. Actually, that's real bodhisattva activity, you know, to have that intention of putting your body on the line for others. Same with the police, you know. And so, but again, we have to go through this. Certainly, we can't. I was talking. I think it was George. We were having this conversation because of one of our students who was a monastic and then now serves in the military and is in the police force, and like they can't uphold their vows, obviously, as a monastic, and so they're not a monastic anymore. So that's something that, you know, we have to work with individually. You know, there isn't one kind of magic way that you can say, okay, this makes it okay. It's actually a very personal thing. So you actually have to work really one-on-one with those students to help them navigate that for themselves. But it is a kind of specific role in the military. So the military does pay the tuition to train chaplains. So that's but they only pay for 2 years. So we have to, a lot of our military chaplains have to rush through everything and try and get everything done in 2 years, which is really stressful. Sometimes they're deployed somewhere and they can't. So a lot of them do the online program because they can't. You know, their situation is so fluid. But it's definitely, I would say, it's a very individual practice that they have to work with, and that we have to help guide them through.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Hall. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the landscape of Buddhist chaplaincy in Canada. And also you mentioned that you teach Buddhism and modernity.
Yes.
We can ask you about it. So
Sure.
could you
Okay.
speak a little bit about that too?
Sure.
Thanks.
I'm not as familiar with the field in Canada, I'll be honest. I mean, I have colleagues that work there, so we have some of the same kinds of issues, but in terms of the government oversight and the certifying, I think there's probably differences. So there's definitely differences between America and Canada in terms of government, certainly in terms of healthcare, for example. So I'm not as familiar with the healthcare chaplaincy field in Canada, but I could definitely put you in touch with somebody who could tell you more. I don't want to misrepresent something that I don't know as much about. And the other question, so the course that I teach on Buddhism and modernity is a course where it's, I basically provide a survey of Buddhism outside of, like coming from its Asian context and coming into Europe, to North America, to other parts of the world, and particularly in the United States, particular streams of Buddhist traditions that really took root. So mindfulness, for example, where does mindfulness come from? And what traditions really influenced the teachers who then brought mindfulness to the West? Vipassana, so insight meditation practices. So there's a whole group of people like John Kabat-Zinn and Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg. Actually, they all taught their first courses at Naropa University, 1974, the first gathering of... So Naropa itself is actually a kind of gateway place for some of these traditions, definitely mindfulness and insight meditation, but also Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. The main kind of forms of Buddhist that is the most practiced in terms of what you might call convert Buddhists, or people who didn't grow up culturally Buddhist. So you also have heritage communities that came through waves of immigration. So we also look at those communities and what some of the challenges or differences there are in heritage communities as opposed to conversion communities that are predominantly white, middle class. There's less, there's sort of hopefully more of a kind of combining, but they were quite polarized for a long time. So we look at all of those communities, but then we also look at various issues around social justice. So we look at race, we look at gender, we look at sexual preferences, like all of these things in terms of how does Buddhism respond to all of these things, the ecological crisis, and also scandals and misconduct in Buddhist communities. So we have quite a number of those in Western countries of different Buddhist communities that have been rocked by misconduct, sexual misconduct and scandals by teachers and within communities. And so our students really want to learn how to navigate all of that. So I teach that course. Yeah. Thank you. I think there was,
Thank you, Professor Hall. That was all just so interesting. And I was wondering, because you said at the very beginning that there isn't yet a total consensus on how one teaches Buddhist chaplaincy.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, for those 4 parts that you outlined, sort of,
Yeah.
If I've got it right, the theological, the socially engaged, the sort of more practical, and then the meditation part.
Yeah.
Is that 4-fold division quite common, as far as you know, across different chaplaincy programs, or are there some actually very different approaches in America right now? So that was just, first part. And then the second part is just, is that sort of 4-fold division actually based on the Christian chaplaincy approach?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I don't think that I think what makes, so that 4-fold division is how we do it at Naropa. I would say there's definitely similarities, but I would say that Naropa and any of the universities that are private universities have much more flexibility in the meditation component than state universities do. So if you go to a state university, you can get away with teaching like secular mindfulness, right? But you can't start teaching really deep meditation or contemplative practices from religious traditions. It's just not part of, because they're state-funded institutions. So different organizations have different restrictions. So it's not all, they're not all the same. I would say one of the main things is the contemplative practice. So I think we're the only program that requires students to do a meditation retreat, for example. I'm not certain, but I'm pretty sure we are. And what was the second question?
About whether that division is roughly based on Christian.
Oh, yeah. So the current certifying organizations, much of that criteria is based on Christian models. And the one that we are most sort of interested in is, and how we do this, is the theological component. Because Christian traditions, for example, if you ask a scriptural reference for chaplaincy, we'll go to kinds of places that Christian chaplains will go to. Even Jewish chaplains, there's a lot of examples. But there's not really a consensus from the Buddhist traditions. And so that's something that we're interested in, is what scriptural content should all Buddhist chaplains know. And that's really tricky because of the variety of Buddhist traditions as well, right? What models? And so, there's definitely, we're still working under this Christian model, and there's I would say the consensus of the agreement, so the organizations that I listed where we formed a Buddhist ministry working group, we're going to meet in a month or so. One of the things that we're talking about is what kind of frameworks do we need actually to certify, board-certified Buddhist chaplains? Why do we need to keep relying on the Christian models? We should come up with our own frameworks. And so that's something that we're interested in developing, certainly. Yeah, thanks. Anyone else?
Maybe this is the last question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hall, for your wonderful sharing. So during your sharing, I also sort of pick up the integration lab.
Yes.
I believe this is something you mentioned about students having the time to resolve their own personal struggles.
Yeah.
Is that? So I'm just interested in this bit because personally I work in the medical school, and one of the challenges that I'm facing right now is that during the course of medical education, it has been increasingly difficult for students to work out their own grief and trauma.
Yeah.
2 months ago, I was this student in a class about palliative care, and she burst into tears because she couldn't actually bear seeing the patient pass away. And just last week, I also got a student in my class, and when he was doing a presentation on grief, he also was holding his tears because his grandmother recently passed away.
Yeah.
So I'm just hoping to learn more about this integration lab that you're doing, and what else could be done in your curriculum design to address that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you. It's a really important point. So, you know, the intention behind having this is one to, as a sort of, you know, releasing a kind of steam, you know, it's sort of like, you know, letting the steam out of the pot kind of thing. Otherwise it's going to just, right? And also because it's a cohort model as well. So you're going through training, this really intense training, whether it's medical training, counseling training, or chaplaincy training. You're going through together as a cohort. As faculty, we sometimes call it the rock tumbler, because you're actually rubbing up against each other with all your sharp corners, and then, you know, you're kind of maybe smoothing each other out, but it can be painful and difficult. So, and you're also really kind of going deeply into training how to care for others during these really difficult moments. So medical professionals, counselors and chaplains, I think all should have this kind of thing. Sometimes, you know, our students will get together during the integration lab, and all they want to do is, somebody wants to cry, and everyone sits with them and lets them cry, which is okay. It's okay to do that. It's a normal human response. But sometimes it might need to be there might be, this happens quite a lot in a cohort program, where sometimes students might have some difficulties with each other. Somebody just winds somebody else up. You know, they irritate you, but it's like there's something to be learned from that person that's irritating you. So let's have a conversation about that. Let's try and diffuse that situation, right? It's just helpful. It's just helpful to have that space to be able to allow you to be human whilst you're going through this training, instead of like holding on to it all the time. That's not going to make you a good doctor. It's not going to make you a good counselor. It's not going to make you a good chaplain. You really have to be able to have that kind of processing. And so sometimes we're also trying to build it more into some of our courses as well, not just a separate thing, but actually build some of that into particular courses at the same time. It's again, this is another course that is hard for us to justify to the administration sometimes, but it's absolutely key in terms of the development, the actual formation piece. Without it, I don't think that you're going to have, I don't think that a lot of the students would be ready if they didn't have that ability to have that processing. So it can be very formless. It doesn't, you know, there isn't like a set syllabus, but it requires really good facilitators who can kind of hold the space for everybody. And maybe, you know, sometimes students get into arguments about things, and you have to be able to help them work through that. And we ask the students in the interview process, are you willing to do that kind of work with a group of people that you're going to be with for 3 years? In and out, you know. Like, are you willing to do that? And at the end, actually, they come out and they have a really close bond. Even sometimes students that have been really in conflict for most of it, they come out and they have a very, very strong bond with each other for years after, you know, they remain lifelong friends, actually. So that's really key, is to have, that's Sangha, right? You know, that's actually a definition of Sangha. Community, you know, looking out for each other on the path. That's a really important piece. So thank you for asking that as the final question. I appreciate it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hall, thank you very much for a very informative and inspiring lecture today. And thank you all for joining us. I wish you all a good evening.